All right. Well, hello. It's me, Michael Anthony Giudice. Welcome to my new channel, Ask an Author. And for our first live interview, we've got a great guest. Um, so you can actually ask two authors if that's your preference. You don't have to just stick with one. We had a little technical difficulty. So, being that we're starting late, we better get right to it. And I'd like to bring in my buddy, author extraordinaire, John LeMay. Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, Michael, so you can hear me? It's all good?
There, perfect now. Yeah.
Wow, I can't believe it. Okay,
We finally made it work.
cool.
Hey, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate you doing this.
Cool. I didn't know I
And
was your first guest. So
first ever guest. The channel has
cool.
been live for a week, so you are the first and most important guest that we've ever had,
Oh, wow.
which is true. Um, okay, so we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about your brand new book, the New Mexico Book of Witches. We're going to talk about your writing career, prolific writing career, and then I'm going to ask for a little behind the scenes or input from for some of the people that'll watch and want to know about becoming an author and how they can do it. But let's get started with this because you've got a brand new book out and it is
Yeah,
it's absolutely
right.
the right very timely one, and it
Yeah.
is.
The New
Oh, there it
Mexico,
is.
yeah, New Mexico Book of Witches.
So let me ask you this before you may want to defer your answer until later, and if you do, I understand. Are there such thing as witches? Do you believe?
Yes.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
All
Well, I
right.
mean, it's pretty easy. So if you mean like, are there magical witches? I'd still say yes. Yeah.
Okay. So there are. Well, okay. Well, we'll get to that. All right. So there are witches, which led you to what led you? Because your books have a varied subject matter, but a lot of them deal with subjects that are out of the mainstream, witches, things like that. How do you even decide to write a book about New Mexico witches? What's the prompt to do that?
I was probably researching one of my other books, who knows which one, and I was probably just reading some New Mexico history book that had a story about witchcraft in it that I thought was interesting. And then I probably read another book that had another witch story. And that's basically what happened with my book on Ash Upson. I kept reading about Ash in different books here and there. And I thought, well, I'd like to read a whole book on just Ash. And same thing, there's not a book just on witches as far as the whole state goes. There's some really great ones like the Witches of Abiquiu.
Mhm.
I think that's how you say it. Is it Abiquiu? Is that how you say it?
Yep. Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean that's a great one. Really scholarly tome just devoted to the witchcraft incidents they had there back in I think it was the 1600s or 1700s. I've already forgotten, but there wasn't a book that just tried to collect every single witchcraft story in the state. And my book actually doesn't collect them all, but it collects the more pertinent ones at least.
Mhm. How much research, like what's the time commitment for you to create a book like this? How much time are you spending researching these stories and putting all that information together?
This one, is fairly thick and it's got lots of footnotes and in notes and things like that. So not every day for 6 months, but probably about 6 months. I might have taken a break here and there to work on something else, but I
Mhm.
would say, yeah, 6 months seems about right.
Okay. So obviously, with a book, let's see how many pages, 332 pages long. With a book that long, there's a number of witch stories in here. Does New Mexico have a most famous witch or something that New Mexico is known
Most
for?
famous. Well, I don't know that I'd call La Llorona, what is it, La Llorona a witch, but
Mhm.
some people think she's a witch. I'd say she's probably our most famous ghost.
Mhm.
The one spot in New Mexico,
Is she in the book, by the way?
I went ahead and put her in there as
Mhm.
I collected every story that I could find that portrayed her as a witch as opposed to just being a ghost. So I did put her in there. Let's see. I would say if you want to go to like a witch spot that had witches living there, the oldest house in Santa Fe is really famous for allegedly having these two sisters that were witches. And the story goes that they had two different young men trying to court the same young woman, and they both came to the witches asking for love potions. And the guy who got the love potion first, he won. The one who got the second love potion, it didn't work, and he came back to see the witches, and he was angry, and he attacked them. And the story goes that they beheaded him, and then he then became like the headless horseman of that road in Santa Fe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then there's also a witch's grave you can go visit in Las Cruces, and or more specifically in Mesilla, but they don't know what her name is. But it's if you go to this little cemetery, the burial plot really sticks out because it's like a 6 foot by 6 foot concrete block above ground with a crucifix embedded in it, and they claim that's a witch that they sealed into the ground, and that the cracks in the concrete are her trying to get out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So, have you ever had any practical real life experience with a witch?
No, no.
No. Are you open to it?
Yeah, I don't want one. No.
So if one comes along and knocks on the
Yeah.
door or comes to see you at an event somewhere,
Hmm.
your hands off. Okay. So with 332 pages, I mean, what's the number of witch stories that
Mm.
that permeate? Because New Mexico obviously has a very rich and very long history,
Yeah.
going back to 1600s. So how many stories are there? Were you starved for material, or did you
Oh
have like
no.
an abundance of it?
No, definitely an abundance. And how the book works is there's an introduction that basically tells you most everything you need to know about New Mexico witches in general. Following the introduction are little vignettes and stories on different witches and warlocks and skinwalkers and things of that nature. Let's see. I do a lot of stories from the Spanish colonial period, and then I go to the territorial period. And since we both have so many Billy the Kid fans, I wanted to mention that the former New Mexico governor, Samuel B. Axtell, after he was removed as a governor, he became a judge in New Mexico. And he actually had a trial involving witchcraft. And I
Really?
have the whole newspaper article right here. Would you like me to read it? Do you
Yeah,
think?
I'd love to hear that.
All right. So I believe it was in the year 1882. So not too long after Billy got gunned down. All right. So the story was called Whipped for Witchcraft. It appeared in the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican on October 2nd, 1882. Again, it featured former New Mexico Governor Samuel B. Axtell, who, as we all know, famously oversaw much of the state during the Lincoln County War of 1878 until he was replaced by Lew Wallace. And even though he was disgraced and Axtell was removed from his position as governor in 1882, he was serving as Chief Justice of the territory. So here's the article from the Santa Fe Daily New Mexicans. Sorry, the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican. Persons just returned from Tierra Amarilla, the Rio Arriba County Court was in session last week, advised of a trial before Chief Justice Axtell, which recalls the dark deeds of centuries ago when torture and even the stake were resorted to as persuasives in cases where confessions were wanted, renunciations of faith were desired, or withheld information was sought to be extorted. This modern barbarity occurred in Tierra Amarilla in the year of our Lord 1882. The offender is Felipe Madrid, and his victim was a woman with whom years ago he was intimate. Felipe had broken off relations with his sometime associate, and after years of promiscuous distribution of attention to other females, was seized by a loathsome disease. After months of suffering, he conceived that he had been bewitched by the woman alluded to, and whose name the writer could not learn. He was encouraged in this by Cipriano Medino and other associates, and finally determined to free himself of the spell by adopting the only course known to the believers in witchcraft, which of course is to make the offending witch cure the patient, and if she refuses, to whip her to death. Accordingly, he sent 3 men from Tierra Amarilla to Abiquiu with instructions to bring the woman to his house. They obeyed, and when they had brought her to him, Madrid tied her up by the hands in his house and told her if she did not cure him, he would whip her to death. She protested her innocence and declared her inability to effect the cure, whereupon Madrid whipped her with a black snake until she was very nearly dead. Black snake is in quotes. I don't know if he really had a black snake he whipped her with, or if that's alluding to something else.
Mhm.
Okay, but back to the article. She at least promised to cure him, being willing to promise anything in order to be released. It's almost over here. Madrid let her down, intending to renew the whipping if she failed to make her promise good. The woman, to gain time, called for ointments and medicines and finally succeeded in escaping from the house. Once she made her way back to Abiquiu, the matter was brought to the attention of the grand jury, and an indictment for assault and battery was the result. The case being tried, the prisoner was fined $150 in costs, that being the extent of the law in this case, as the prisoner was in a state of health which would not admit of his being in prison. So, back then they
Wow.
could accuse just about anybody of being a witch, and but this guy, he didn't really get away with it because, as you can see, he did get fined and was
Mhm.
almost thrown in jail.
$150. So I'm thinking back to I think Tunstall was paying his cowboys about $40 a month
Yeah.
to ride. So about 4 months' wages, and
Mm,
you could almost whip somebody to death. But I guess since she survived, maybe they went a little easier on him. Wow,
yeah.
that's um, that's crazy. Were there any, or are there any witch stories that are centered around any of the principles of the Lincoln County War?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Lincoln County had a witch. I found this story in a book called Mysteries and Miracles of New Mexico by Jack Cutts. And unfortunately, he didn't say where in Lincoln County this witch was. But I know Cutts, when he was writing, he wrote this book in the 80s. So when he said Lincoln County, I believe he meant Lincoln County as it's known to us today, not as it was known in Billy the Kid times when it was literally all of southeast New Mexico. So I think when he says there was a witch, it was in Lincoln County, maybe not in Lincoln Village or Lincoln Town, but just somewhere in Lincoln County. And her name was Donna Pepita or something along those lines. And it's just your typical story of she was, one of the older ladies wherever it was that they lived. And people claimed that they would peer through her window and they would watch her detach her own limbs,
Oh.
because that's a weird witch trait of Mexico and New Mexico, that witches could like remove their arms or their head or their legs. And Donna Pepita would take off her arms and like wash them in a tub, and then she'd take her head off and wash that in the tub. And that's the story that they claimed they saw her doing that. And that's obviously just a folk tale, but it's interesting. Yeah, Lincoln County had a witch, and then also Ma'am Jones, Barbara Jones of the Pecos. In Eve Ball's book, Ma'am Jones of the Pecos, she has a story about Barbara Jones going to see a neighbor when they lived in Ruidoso, and how this neighbor wasn't necessarily a witch. She might be more what we'd call a curandera, like a folk healer or something like that. But Barbara Jones claimed that a storm was coming, and that this her Hispanic neighbor went out and yelled at the storm and chanted at it and threw salt at it and said magic words to it. And Barbara Jones really says that the storm like magically changed course and went around them. And basically, she said she knew better than to ever mention it to the local pastor and just kept that to herself.
Mhm.
So
Wow,
I
that's
think those
wild.
are, yeah, those are only kind of Billy the Kid, Lincoln County stories that I remember from the book. Because otherwise, the witches are definitely more so, northern New Mexico and Santa Fe Taos.
Mhm. Gotcha. In fact, Natalie has a question. She says, "Would you say that northern New Mexico has more witch lore than the rest of the state?" And I'm going
Hmm.
to guess that the answer is yes on that,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, and again, Abiquiu has so many interesting stories. Their witch trials would make a great Halloween movie because they had demonic possession. They had people claimed could breathe fire, all sorts of crazy stuff. One of the witches turned into a werewolf and attacked the local priest. I mean, and this is all stuff that's maybe not true, but it's in the historical record. These people who lived back then claim that's what really happened, because this priest in his letters, really says, yes, so and so turned into a wolf and he attacked me. And
It's kind of incredible
uh-huh.
kind of the longevity that some of these things have. Look, we weren't there, so we don't know exactly what
Yeah.
happened. Somebody may have turned into a wolf, but sometimes just the description, maybe the guy is, half crazed, and maybe he's got a long beard and long hair, and
Hmm.
maybe the preacher, the um, the person says something like, "Oh, it looks like they turned into a wolf," and then somebody takes
Hmm.
the looks like out, and then they turned into a wolf,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, here we are, 100 and plus years later, and um, we give it some credence, or some people do. So I do think it's really interesting. What's the most recent witch story slash sighting that's in the book? In other words, how
Mm.
recent does this go?
So I tried to stay away from really recent stuff where people are still alive, but I know a man was convicted of murdering a witch, I think as late as 2013.
Oh,
But that's just kind of something I mentioned offhand. I mean, I think in the book, the most recent story I included was one from 1975, I think it was, where they saw a werewolf outside of Grants, New Mexico, or in other words, like a skinwalker. And that was also in the newspapers, in all seriousness. And something I thought was interesting about that story, I tried to research it best that I could to see, was it just a high school prank? Because the witnesses were basically high school kids. But they have a Facebook group, dedicated to Grants, New Mexico. And somebody brought up the old story. And I noticed in the comments, nobody made fun of it. Nobody said, I know
hmm,
so and so, they made it up. Instead, everybody took it seriously that I saw, and everybody had their own skinwalker story that they added to it. And that's maybe an interesting subject to get onto is, in the movies that we watch today, vampires and werewolves are these distinctive supernatural creatures, but really back in the 1700s, 1600s, especially during the Spanish Inquisition, all werewolves were basically witches, and so were vampires. And there was never this concept of someone getting bitten by a werewolf and they turn into a wolf. Historically speaking, all werewolves, the ones in Europe especially, they would don an animal pelt, and they would do witchcraft to become a werewolf. And that's incredibly similar to the Navajo skinwalker that we have in New Mexico, even though they're so far removed from medieval Europe. It's really the exact same techniques. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, today we think of werewolves as monsters, but really back then, historically speaking, a werewolf was just a different type of witch.
interesting. So, because a lot of these, when I call them stories, I don't mean stories that they're not true,
Hmm.
but a lot of these stories come from a similar time period. Is there
Yeah.
something that can we go back and say, hey, it's because of this or this? Because if there were witches, werewolves that were witches, vampires, they should still be here now. Have they
Mhm.
just gone underground? Do we have 8 billion people, and it's easier for them to kind of meld
Mm.
into the rest of society? What do you think?
So there are a few people in rural New Mexico today that still see the witch fireballs. That's something else that's not necessarily distinctive to New Mexico, but it's very well known among the rural communities here that witches will turn into balls of light or fireballs, and they'll dance around through the air.
Hmm,
So yeah, witches here don't really ride brooms and things like that. But people today still claim that they see the balls of fire dancing around, and people today are still superstitious about saying the word skinwalker late at night. If they're out actually in the desert, or if you whistle at night, that's also a superstition that you might summon lechuza or a skinwalker. And people are definitely still seeing the skinwalkers, though, that's for sure. Skinwalkers are probably more prevalent now than they used to be, because I honestly didn't find very many stories about, quote unquote skinwalkers from the 1800s and the 1700s. There's something that's really emerged in the public consciousness much more recently, and there's a lot of stories from the Grants area where people, claim they see them keeping pace with their car. Stories of the lechuza are fairly common. I think today witches, though, have kind of just been rebranded, maybe, and
mhm.
So I mean, they're not really thought of as witches as much anymore. And two, back in the old days, there wasn't always a distinction between folk healers and curanderas and things like that and witches. Whereas today, someone will just say that's a curandera or curandero, and
Oop, I think we froze you, John. Oh,
oh,
there
did
you
we
are. You're
freeze?
back.
Okay,
There, you're
good.
back. All right. Wow, good stuff. So I'm going to go back to the first question. You do believe that there are witches,
Mhm.
and you at first you said like the kind of magical or put a spell on, but you said even those exist. So how do we know? How do I know if
Mm,
I'm in the presence of a witch?
yeah.
Does the witch tell me? Do they have the black hat, the green skin, or I mean, how am I going to know?
No, huh.
Give me
No,
some
uh-uh.
tips.
No, I don't really like to use the term good witches and bad witches. I think again, there's curanderas and folk healers, which I wouldn't call them a good witch because I just wouldn't say they're a witch. They're just a healer. So I would say most of the time, most witches will mostly stay hidden. You know,
Mhm.
um,
Even
although
the
there's
name
yeah,
witch kind of has a bad rap and
yeah,
connotation to it. That's why you would have to say good witch, because if
yeah,
not, then I guess people would think you're bad, but that's not necessarily the case, huh?
yeah. I'm a little more open-minded now to the idea that people can kind of manifest what they really believe in sometimes.
Mhm.
So I think there are people who definitely have a lot of skills with their manifestation. So I wouldn't. They might call themselves witches. I don't know that I would call them witches. I tend to think of witch as only a bad thing. So I
Mhm.
mean, maybe again, there's people out there who have abilities where they can maybe kind of manifest their wants and dreams. But yeah, I wouldn't. I don't know. To me, a real witch is someone who uses blood sacrifices and the really dark stuff.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. So people want to get the book. They can find it on Amazon. I'm sure other online booksellers. Can they get it anywhere locally in New Mexico if they want to go to their local bookstore?
Yeah, especially in Albuquerque, Treasure House Books has it. He keeps ordering them quite a bit because they sell out fairly fast. And I can see from my retailer website that stores are ordering them as opposed to just people on Amazon. So I don't know where all carries it in Albuquerque, but Treasure House Books for sure.
Treasure House Books. I think is that in Old Town?
Yeah,
Okay. Treasure House Books in Old Town, Albuquerque. Otherwise, you can go online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, I'm
yeah.
sure any other retailer, and you can pick up the New Mexico Book of Witches by John LeMay. Now, John, talk about a writing career. This is your Amazon authors page. And I know I've
Yeah.
talked about this before. 128 titles.
Oh, that's kind of a mistake because I also do a little magazine that they register as a book.
It's still
So yeah,
128 titles, John.
technically, and sometimes books that I've contributed to for other authors, they list those on there. But I think I've done about 50 books, just me personally, and like with Noe Tourist, that you've got your mouse cruiser on there, the Cowboys and Aliens.
Mhm. So, how long have you been an author? How many years?
I think I had my first book published when I was 22 or 23, and now I'm 38, so about 15 years.
Gotcha. 15 years. And this is your full-time job. You are an
It is
author.
now.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't until like book 20 or so I think that I was able to kind of start making a living. So
Uh-huh. Gotcha. All
yeah,
right.
and I did want to say before I forget, this book, Classic Monsters Unmade, if you're watching like right now live tonight, or if you see this tomorrow on Halloween, this is free on Amazon Kindle. No strings
Classic
attached.
Monsters
Yeah.
Unmade. Here it is. Let's go to that page right there. And if I look at the Kindle Unlimited, $0.00. Is that what we're looking
Yeah,
at?
and it's
Very cool.
yeah. So I mean, if you download it tonight or tomorrow, I mean, it's always going to be on your Kindle. So,
Mhm.
and this is
Yeah.
all about Universal Studios unmade monster movies, scripts they wrote like Wolfman versus Dracula that they never shot, or lost horror movies like London After Midnight, Abbott and Costello, Meet the Creature from the Black Lagoon, that sort of thing. So yeah, so film history.
And this one's volume 2, covering 1956 through 2000, it looks like.
Yeah.
There's a volume 1, so there were
Yep.
even more of those
Yeah,
unmade
and
films, huh?
it's volume 1 that's free, and then volume 2, I think, is the one that's, not free at the moment.
Gotcha. Okay, so volume 1, Classic Monsters Unmade by John LeMay, Lemay, and it's free. It's
Yeah.
freaking free. Yeah, you need to go get that. Let me go back and see if I can pull that one up. That's very cool. So was this always the vision when you started writing that, hey, but I want this to be my one and only career? Or did you get into it and thought, it's a kind of fun thing to do on the side, and it's easy to get people to
Mm.
pay attention when you're an author?
I had hoped to make a living off of it, and I would say, like, I barely make a living off of it. Roswell, where I live, the cost of living is pretty low,
Mhm,
for one, so, I mean, I barely get by, but when I started writing, it was to do these novels, which is, like, Once Upon a Time in Fort Sumner,
mhm,
and it's funny, I've done about 48 nonfiction books and only 2 novels, but novels is what I wanted to do,
mhm.
but nonfiction was just so much easier to break into. That's what I started doing, and I enjoy that too quite a bit. So, since that's where the money was, I kept at that. But I am trying to get those novels off the ground best that I can. And this one, again, Once Upon a Time in Fort Summer, you can see the Skinwalker. So it's basically an aging Billy the Kid in 1950s Fort Sumner squaring off with a Skinwalker.
That's very cool. Yes, and I have the book and I've read it. So you started and you've been at this for 15 years. It now is this is your career. Um, can anybody? Let me rephrase that. Is it possible for anybody that's watching this today, 6 months from today, can anybody be a writer?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Or
And
is
it's
there some bar they have to clear, in order to jump over and say, "Okay, now I have the ability to be a writer or an author?"
no, I don't think so. I think we tend to enjoy the things that we're good at. If we're not good at something, I think it can kind of frustrate us. So I think usually if you enjoy writing, you're probably at least sort of good at it, and you can probably get really good at it if you practice and you have other people give you healthy criticism and advice. So yeah, I think anybody that enjoys it can definitely learn all the nuances. And I mean, I've definitely progressed quite a bit since I was younger. So it's a big learning process. And today you can publish for free on Amazon's KDP platform, so you're not risking being out a lot of money. The only times you're going to pay money is when you hire a really awesome cover artist like I did.
Yeah.
That's Logan Pack. I mean, you can do your own AI art now too, but it's to me AI art it's very noticeable that it's AI, and I think it's fun to have just like another human being, do your art. And then, like stuff like this for this book, I just took old public domain, beautiful paintings and artworks and made my own cover. So if you find stuff that's public domain, that's pretty old, you can come up with really neat designs and do covers that way. So just putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboards, that doesn't really cost you anything but your time. So
Mhm.
your only expense, might just be in hiring a cover artist or someone to help you with your layout and your design work.
I've got to imagine though that with the events that you've done and how you're out in the public eye, that a lot of people have come up to you and said, "Oh my gosh, it's great that you're an author. I've always wanted to write a book. I've always had this idea. I've always had that thing." That probably happens to you pretty often because I certainly hear that.
Yeah.
Um, when that person, when they have done nothing with their idea and they come to you and say, "How do I get started?" What would you tell
Mhm.
them?
Well, I mean, I just tell them to start writing. And it doesn't have to be in order. If you just have an idea for one scene that you think is actually going to take place in the middle of your story or the end of your story, I think it's still best to put that down and then figure out the rest of it later.
So take whatever you have and just
Yeah.
write it down. It doesn't even have to
Mhm.
be a book at that point, but just
Yeah.
write something down. It's like planting a flag on the moon. Like we're here
Yeah.
and we've got this spot we can start from, and then you can continue. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like, that's how the Book of Witches here started. I didn't expect it to be quite this big. I just had the inspiration one day, and I was like, "Well, I better get started, uh, getting some chapters down for this, and maybe I'll publish it 5 years from now, whatever." And then, well, my interest took over, and I was like, "Yeah, this is something I wanna finish right now," and so I did. But I have probably 10 or 20 books right now that are started that are just a few chapters here and there, but who knows when I'll get back to them.
Mhm.
I wrote chapters for a book a couple days ago that, I probably won't publish for another couple years. So it's kind of like a farmer, planting crops that he won't harvest and get money from, until quite a bit later.
Mhm. I got it. Hey, that brings up a good question because this is I tend to work on one at a time
Hmm.
because my memory's not good. And so if I leave it for 6 months and then come back, I have to start over. So when you do that, you've got this book, you've written a few chapters, and maybe you come back to it in 6 or 8 months. Do you have to catch yourself up on where you were, or do you still remember and know what the next thing to write is?
Yeah, yeah, I have to catch myself up because anybody that's watched me on one of these tends to notice, like, if you ask me a question about the witch book, I'd probably have to open it up and actually see the answer for myself because I just won't retain it after so many months.
Mhm,
So yeah, I definitely forget. I do keep pretty good track of my fiction though. Probably like because you enjoy Back to Billy so much,
mhm.
and that's your world and your history. I bet you remember that pretty well, right? Don't you?
Those are much easier
Yeah.
than the other books, yeah, because
Mhm.
I know the characters and I know the world that they play in. So, generally, what I would do if I was writing and I took a few days or a week off, I just go back and read the last paragraph of the last chapter and go,
Mhm.
okay, yeah, now I know where I need to go next. Um, so yeah, okay. Um, the I want to understand your process for writing a novel. Um, I've been on the record as saying I don't have a process. I
Yeah.
sit there, I open up the computer, there's a play button I press in my head, and the movie just starts going. And my job at that point, I see as an interpreter. It's
Mhm.
like this is already created. I just have to get it into words so that the person reading it can see the same thing I am. I don't do any construction on my stories, I don't do any planning, nothing like that. How does your process work when you're writing one of the 21 Gun
Yeah.
series? How does that work?
So the very first one I ever did, I would say that one was kind of reverse engineered, which isn't maybe the easiest way to do a book. And what I mean by that, excuse me, is I wanted that book to end on Acoma Mesa, Sky City outside of Albuquerque, because that's
Mhm,
just such a cool location. So, like, I knew writing that book that it had to end there. And of course, the book hinges quite a bit around Billy the Kid and his stolen tombstone, and that has nothing to do with Acoma or Sky City. So that's when I say, I reverse engineered the story. Uh, it didn't really come together naturally. It was kind of like stringing together these really cool set pieces that I just thought were neat. And thank God it did turn out pretty coherent and decent. But
mhm.
the second one, Once Upon a Time in Fort Sumner, I did kind of like what you did. I didn't really have ah well, they call it pantsing, as in flying by the seat of your pants. I've heard that as a
Okay.
term,
Uh-huh.
pantsing, where you just make it up as you go.
Uh-huh.
Once upon a time in Fort Sumner, I did just make up, as I went, and it turned out much better, I found.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
sometimes I just make it up as I go, and the story just kinda writes itself, and then, other times, again, I just come up with these cool ideas, and I try to just sew them all together.
Mhm. Are you ever surprised by where the story goes when you're flying by the seat of your pants? In other words, does it come as
Mhm.
a shock to you in that moment, that you just wrote something?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, and it's happening, more and more as I continue writing these novels. But, yeah, so, the way the novels work, they're kinda like Star Wars, where you go backwards, so to speak.
Mhm.
The first one's set in 1976, and in that one, I had the characters talk about events from 1950, basically involving a brushy Bill Roberts type character. And when I went to actually write that prequel, which is Once Upon a Time in Fort Sumner, I found what those characters said in 1976 really didn't work for the story I was writing, so I just kind of decided, well, those characters, much like we do, they just got their history wrong. They think they know what happened, but really that didn't happen. So that's kind of how I deal with my continuity errors. Is I just say, well, these characters, they got their history wrong, and yeah, but because yeah, originally Once Upon a Time in Fort Sumner was really beholden to the continuity I had established in the first book, and the story wanted to go somewhere else, and I let it, and it turned out, again, I think a lot better than the first book.
Mhm. Do you ever go back because you edit your own work?
Mhm.
Do you ever go back and edit things out and go, nope, don't like it, or or do you say, hey, that's the story that came to me,
Mhm.
and I'm just going to leave it as is?
Do you mean like after it's been published, will I go out and
No, no,
revise?
but
Okay.
before it's published, are there things that you go back and take out
Mm.
rather than explain better or differently? Do you just exercise a part of the book and go,
Oh,
no, that just doesn't
yeah,
work?
absolutely, and I kinda just jokingly call that a reshoot because they do that in movies where they'll go and reshoot a scene because they had a better idea. Like, I did it recently in, the 3rd book I'm writing. I'm tentatively calling it Billy the Kid and the Boy Bandit King, and I wanted Billy to be carrying around, like, a family heirloom throughout the book, and when I did the first draft, Billy was carrying around a pocket watch that belonged to his father, and I had that in a lot of the scenes. And later I decided, no, it would make more sense if he had like a scarf or something that smelled like his mother, or he thought still smelled like his mother. So like I changed a pocket watch into a scarf, things
Mhm.
like that.
Got it.
And yeah, I changed some of the characters' races, like had to go back and change that. So yeah, I'm definitely not afraid to revise the story.
Mhm. And is there some master plan for the rest of the books? Because
Mhm.
your intent is it's the 21 gun series,
Yeah.
right? There's going to be 7 trilogies, 21 total books. Do you know where book 21 ends?
Possibly. I
Oh,
think I do
wow.
now, but, I'm sure as it develops, I'll change my mind. But yeah, each one's gonna do the same thing, each time. Again, the first book was 1976. Well, I'll eventually get back to the characters from the '70s, and I'm gonna do a book with them in 1977 that revolves around, Victorio Peak and Operation Goldfinder, because that really happened in 1977. I'll do another book, and this, kind of, I wouldn't call it continuity. They're all the same continuity, but the twins from this book, Hondo and Pancho, I'll do another '50s adventure with them, and then I'll do another adventure with Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett. In which case, I think I'm going to have Billy the Kid involved in the Albert Fountain disappearance.
Mm,
Not,
interesting.
I mean, each time, each trilogy, it's going to be the same pattern of 1970s, 1950s, back to the Old West for the last book.
Mhm. Very cool. Um, is there a limit? I mean, you've got kind of a rough idea of, all 21 books, but is there a limit of how many stories you can write about one character or set of characters? Do you see that? Or do you think it's, we don't have an unlimited number of days, but
Hmm.
there's thousands of things that you could tell about your life. Is it the same with these characters, or do you reach a point where you go, I think I need to leave them alone and go in another direction?
No, I'm already doing what you did, where I thought it would be X amount of books, but I came up with too many ideas. And so, I mean, I'm sure there'll be spin-offs outside of the 21 books that I don't know how I'll differentiate them, whether they'll be like novellas or short stories or what, but I have already more ideas, that I can already see not really fitting into the 21. So we'll see what happens.
Gotcha. Hey, how do you come up with names for your characters? That's one of the things I find
Mhm.
it pretty fun, and sometimes the names are just silly or or have some sort of meaning. But do you have some sort of resource? Like, is there a book of names that you go to, or you just make it up out of thin air?
No, I like how comic book characters, they have a word for when their names, not when they rhyme, but like Clark Kent, they both start with a Clark
Mhm,
Kent and
mhm,
or Bruce Banner, things like that. I like those comic book names. That's why I named my Skinwalker villain. His name is Macho Mescal, and
mhm,
Macho is actually an Apache word for wolf. So,
mhm.
and Mescal is just kind of a fairly common Apache last name. So I like that Macho Mescal. All the characters, the heroes, their names typically ended in O, like Hondo, Pancho, Dorado. So I just look for another cool O name. But yeah, I mean, they're bigger than life fantasy characters, so I like them to have names that you wouldn't probably encounter in real life.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it does, it makes them more memorable, right?
Yeah,
Tom Smith is not a memorable
yeah.
name. I'm sure there's a Tom Smith that'll watch at some point and go, "Oh, you son of a bitch." It just doesn't have that hook that would make you
Yeah.
remember it. So, cool. All right. So the 21 Gun series, that leaves you with a lot of work, but you mentioned that you're writing some other novels. Are they outside of the series? In other words, is there a whole different world that you're exploring already in the world of fiction?
No, not yet. No, they're all I think in this 21 Guns world, but I think the only novel I've done outside of that is I've got one I'm writing about dinosaurs.
Hmm,
And I don't know if I'll ever finish it. It was just one of those instances where I had a wild hair to write a few chapters and I wrote them while I felt like it. So I've got the foundation of a book ready if I decide it's worthy of my time or I feel the inspiration or whatever.
gotcha. How much time on an average day do you spend writing? Not
Hmm.
creating graphics or marketing, but actually writing.
So with nonfiction, that's a little bit easier because with nonfiction, it's like you've got clay and all you do is you sculpt the clay because you're working with existing information. But with fiction, it's like you gotta make your own clay, then you've gotta sculpt it too. So you understand that you're making something from nothing. And that's something you can't really force if you're not in the mood. That's what's frustrating. I really can't force myself to work on a novel if I feel like it. I can kind of force myself to work on nonfiction and come up with something that I can probably finesse and edit later and make more palatable. But yeah, fiction is just not gonna happen if I'm not in the mood. Kinda like somebody's wife. If you're not in the mood,
Right.
it's just not gonna happen.
Not in the mood. I get it.
Yeah.
The two novels that I have upcoming, I finished both of them on separate trips to Texas. I stayed in an Airbnb and it was really quiet out in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't there for writing, but it was just so quiet and peaceful and nobody else around, no interruptions, that I wound up finishing, I mean, like 25,000 words finishing one of
Wow.
them. And then the second one, just it happened the same way. So I get that. Do you have a time of day, morning, afternoon, evening, when you're more productive or more creative?
Yeah, morning right after coffee is the best time, and typically I do nonfiction in the morning, and then for some reason, late at night, when I should be going to bed is when the fiction will hit me.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yep.
or
And
just yeah, sometime in the evening after dinner for some reason, fiction is easier.
And is it there in your office where you are now? Is that where you do
Mhm.
your writing, or do
Yeah.
you go that's your spot,
Well,
right?
so that's where I write. The ideas are more likely to come if I'm out doing something, if I'm out walking, and typically I always want to write the worst when I can't. When I'm not
Mhm,
able to write, I have the ideas and the inspiration, and then when you actually sit down in front of the keyboard, I don't know, it's difficult. You almost feel forced.
mhm, yeah. Have you ever lost a great idea because you were out running or lifting weights or
Probably.
something, and
Yeah.
then got back home and said, "Oh my gosh, what
Mhm.
happened to it?"
Yeah, I'm learning to finally carry a notepad. I mean, I guess you can put notes on your phone. I've never actually learned how to do that, believe it or not.
Mhm.
But yeah, so sometimes I carry a notepad with me to write something down because I
Make sure
definitely
that you
get in these creative windows where I just get one idea after another. And my other problem is I tend to get too many ideas to use. Like I can't use all the ideas. Like like I said, I'm formulating this adventure with Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett involving the fountain disappearance, and obviously I'm going with the version of Billy the Kid that survived and faked his death. And there's all these different avenues I can explore, and like one of them I'm thinking about is the Spanish American War in Cuba,
Mhm.
because they actually kind of tied the fountain disappearance into that once, which I thought was interesting. And then I'm trying to tie it into La Llorona and some stuff at White Sands. And obviously, I can't use all of those because it'll get totally out of hand, but they're all viable options. So sometimes it's really hard to decide which one do you want to go with.
Mhm. Yeah, so that was going to be the question. Do you ever slap yourself on the hand and say, "Nope, nope, you're
Yeah.
getting too far out. You got to
Yeah.
rein this thing back in."
Yeah, well, and like something else I love about the time of the fountain disappearance, 1896, Leadville, Colorado had a big ice castle, which I think is really cool. Kind of like, I mean, anybody that's watched that awful James Bond movie, Die Another Day, I thought
Mhm.
it was a horrible Bond movie, but they had the big ice castle. Well, again, they had that in Leadville, Colorado, kind of a smaller version of that. It's like, oh, I think that's so cool. It happened around the time of the fountain disappearance. How can I work Leadville's ice castle into the story?
Don't
I
give away
probably
too much
can't.
now.
I don't know. Nobody reads these yet, so I mean, I could spoil the whole series. Nobody would know unless they came back later after it becomes a thing and they watch this.
I got you.
Yeah.
How many novels do you have pieces of now somewhere on your hard
Mm,
drive that you may or may not ever finish? I mean, are we talking 5
yeah.
or 55?
Oh, at least a dozen. Yeah, at least a dozen.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And do you ever feel guilty for not finishing one? Is there an idea you
Mhm.
were in love with, but then the execution, when you started writing it, you just weren't in love with the writing of it?
Mm. Well, no, not exactly, but, like, when you talk about starting them, they're kinda like little strings that pull at me in the back of my
Mhm.
mind. It's like the string is pulling on me, like, "You need to finish that book," and that can drive me a little crazy. But again, I have to start these projects when I have the inspiration to do so, or else maybe they'll never get done. Because again, I've had a lot of books that I've published that have been successes, and they were something that I wrote a couple of chapters for when I felt the inspiration, maybe back in January, and then I finally get back to them all the way later in December, and then I finish it. So it's yeah, but it definitely distracts me for sure.
Mhm. Got it. Got it. Um, okay. So somebody's watching, they want to be an author. You've already told them to write something, and they go, John, I don't even know where to start. I don't even know the first thing to do. Can you give them some encouragement, some advice? Just get them off of square one so that
Yeah.
that book can take shape.
Sure, I would say just find the book that you want to emulate. I mean, stylistically,
Mhm.
obviously you're not going to copy the plot, but again, to talk about Once Upon a Time in Fort Sumner, that was just basically my thought process was, what if Tony Hillerman wrote a book in our neck of the woods, being southeastern New Mexico as opposed to, his four corners, where the Navajo were and all that. I thought, what if Tony Hillerman did a murder mystery with the Apache? And that's kind of how, I read Hillerman. I let him get ingrained in my subconscious because he's very descriptive with his landscapes. He's third person narrative. And then the first book I did, The Noted Desperado Pancho Dumez, it's a first person narrative from a kid. And so for that, I read S.E. Hinton and The Outsiders and her books, which, again, first person is I did this, and first person, you're kind of like an actor portraying a character, whereas in third person, you're like an omniscient narrator. So, they're very different style books. And again, I read what I wanted to emulate to get it really ingrained in my subconscious. And hopefully, if someone wants to do that, they can do the same thing.
No, that's a wonderful tip. So, a
Yeah.
couple tips then. First thing is read a novel stylistically that sounds like or could be like your story. And second, write something, even if it's not the beginning of the book, even if it's the ending or somewhere in the middle, or it's just one scene, one character, one line that would be memorable. Write something down, because when you do, you've got
Yeah.
the beginnings of a book, and until you do, you just have an idea, right?
Hmm.
I'll let you go here. I really appreciate your time, by the way.
I've enjoyed it. Yeah.
Do you you have these novels, right? And a lot of your income is coming from the nonfiction
Mhm.
books, and the novels are. I don't want to say an indulgence, but at this point, it's something that you're developing, right? An audience
Yeah.
for. Does it get to you if they're not, if they don't sell the way that you want? Can you look at that and go, hey, it's an investment in the future, or I'm happy I got the story out, or does it bother you?
No, I look at it as an investment in the future because my gut instinct is that they will be a thing one day.
Mhm.
And that was the origin of my dream when I was a kid, was writing these novels because again, the one I called The Noted Desperado Pancho Dumez, I started when I was 19, and I didn't actually finish it and publish it finally until I was like 35 or 36. So I definitely believe there'll be a thing one day. That's my gut instinct. And I will brag about one cool little thing. So the Billy the Kid Epic series, I actually got to talk to the actor who plays Pat Garrett, Alex Rowe, and he had seen my Pat Garrett book, Tall Tales and Half Truths of Pat Garrett, and he just asked for some tidbits on Garrett. What's some little quirks, things I can add to the character. And I sent him a package of kind of obscure Pat Garrett articles and stuff like that. And I did throw one of these in the package, and I said, Alex, I don't expect you to read it. I'm sure you're busy. Do me a favor and just give it to a producer.
Mhm.
And I said, don't worry, there's nothing in the book that's worthy of cancel culture. It's safe. So who knows? Maybe Alex will throw that at a producer or something. But yeah, and he's a really nice guy. Very down to earth, talkative person. And have you seen any of season 2 yet of Billy the
I
Kid?
haven't. No, I
Yeah,
haven't
I
seen
haven't
any
either.
of it yet.
And I didn't see Alex in the previews as Pat Garrett, but I'm sure he's in there because I know he was going down to film it when he messaged me. So
Mhm. Very cool. Well,
yeah,
I am hopeful that that it winds up being the next epic series, right?
yeah,
The the Once Upon a Time in Fort Sumner. Hey, like that's where these ideas come from. They come from creative people like you, and their books or their screenplays or their short stories or poems or whatever short films, and you just never know which one's going to make it next. John, thank you so much. For anybody watching now or catching this in the future, go to Amazon is an easy way to do it. Look up John LeMay, LeMay. You can find his authors page and all of his 128
yeah,
published published somethings,
yeah,
books, magazines, those kind of things, and lots of great stuff coming from John. The book of which let me get the let me
yeah.
get
The
this
the
back.
New Mexico Book of Witches. So
There it is, New Mexico Book of Witches, brand new release from John LeMay. Make sure you can go get that as well. And if you are a witch and you want to get in touch with John, he's not really into it. So I would say
yeah. No,
probably
I'll
probably
I'll
not.
clarify again. I think some people call themselves witches when they shouldn't. If you're good, I wouldn't say you're a witch. I'd call yourself something else.
Gotcha. Come up with a
Folk
better
healer,
thought.
something like that. Or just a manifester of good things. I wouldn't call yourself a witch.
Wonderful. Oh, last
Yeah.
quick question. What's the next release? What'll we be looking for now that the
Mm.
New Mexico Book of Witches is out? Do you know yet?
Yeah, I'll probably do something similar like the New Mexico Book of Monsters and do folkloric creatures. Might do a book on La Llorona. I don't know, but hopefully Billy the Kid and the Boy Bandit King, the third novel, hopefully that'll be done by Christmas, or if not Christmas, by next spring. So we'll see.
Awesome. 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 Thank you so much for joining me, John. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Continued
Thank you,
success to
Michael.
you,
Yeah.
of course. And we'll come back anytime you have something that you want to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. I'll take you up on it.
All right. We'll do. Thanks. That's John LeMay, everybody. Wonderful guy. Thank you so much from that. And yep, there we go. All right. So I appreciate you joining me for this episode. I'm going to go ahead and give you one little thing before we go. Um, if you're an author, and this is Ask an Author, um, get started. Yeah, I mean, if you have a story, if you have an idea, if you have a passion, put something on paper. You can go back to the last video and see the very first steps of being able to write your book. Look later this week for video number 2 of the next thing to do as it relates to writing a book, but do something, anything. If you write one sentence down, you have a one sentence book. And I think that that's vitally important that you have something to show your ideas and your efforts. This is my Amazon authors page. If you'd be so kind as to go and check out my books, the Back to Billy series, 8 books long. It's these 8 right here. Book number 9 is done. Will be out on my birthday, January 19th. It is the final book in the 9-book series. I've had a great time. But all the books, every single book has 5-star reviews and nothing but. So the people that have read it have enjoyed it, and I'd appreciate it if you check it out. If you're so inclined, start with Back to Billy. That's book number 1 in the series, and I'd love to hear what you think of it. If you have questions about writing your own book, how do you become a ghostwriter? How do you publish a book? How do you get your cover art done? By all means, just leave your question in the comments below. We'll take that up in a future episode. That would be great. And of course, if you are an author and you have works that you'd like to come on and talk about, then by all means, just reach out to me. You can do that at billythekidridesagain@gmail.com. That's the best email address, and we'll have you on a future show. But until then, thanks again to John LeMay for spending so much time with us. Thanks to you, and we'll see you next time on Ask an Author. You all have a great evening. Bye.